You guys all good? Yeah. Thanks for joining us here at Sunshine Railway Station. A fantastic investment, one of the largest rail investments, public rail investments, helping consumers in Victoria's history. And today is important because what we've seen is, and today's good also because I've got the local member, Tim Watts, here, and our infrastructure and transport spokesperson, Anthony Albanese, here. Overnight, in Switzerland, our Prime Minister has made his first foray onto the international stage. And what an embarrassing performance it was. Overnight, the Prime Minister demonstrated in front of the whole world that they are still the opposition in government, thinking like an opposition. Overnight, Tony Abbott had a chance to showcase Australia, and instead he chose to take the low road of playing domestic politics on the international stage. Little discussion about jobs, a lot of discussion about domestic politics, and no vision for Australia's future. Most surprising in his contribution was that he said that the global financial crisis wasn't really a problem of the markets around the world, thus discrediting a lot of the remarkable efforts of the Australian economy and Australian business who did so well with the support of the government to get through the global financial crisis and make Australia's economic performance some of the envy of the rest of the world. Today also we've seen the head of Infrastructure Australia come out and express his concern about the direction of infrastructure investment in this country. I'd like to hand over to our infrastructure spokesperson to talk about that matter, then we take some questions.
Thanks very much, Bill, and it's great to be at the Regional Rail Link project again with not just Bill but the local member, Tim Watts. I have been coming to this project month after month since we put it in as part of our response to the global financial crisis. $3.225 billion of Commonwealth investment into this project. What that has meant is literally thousands of jobs being created here in Victoria. Up to 3,500 permanent workers directly employed by this project on any particular day. And we've seen upgrades. Yesterday I looked at the West Footscray station. Today here at Sunshine. Today here at Sunshine also it's resulted in the removal of a level rail crossing. This is an example of why public transport also assists the road network. 22,000 cars use that level crossing each and every day, meaning they can get across now in quicker time and also, importantly, more safely for the local community. And yet today's submission by the Infrastructure Coordinator Michael Deegan to the Infrastructure Australia Bill Senate inquiry highlights that all that is at risk from Mr Abbott's reckless approach to infrastructure investment in this nation. What this submission shows is that the Abbott government just doesn't get it. It's not just Labor saying this, this is Infrastructure Australia, the very independent body established by the federal government in 2008, after our election in 2007, as one of our first actions of government. In opposition, Tony Abbott said he would strengthen Infrastructure Australia. What we see from the legislation is that he is gutting Infrastructure Australia's independence with this legislation. The Infrastructure Coordinator has pointed out that under this legislation, the Minister will be able to exclude whole classes of infrastructure investment, including public transport. What that means is that when Tony Abbott, who didn't even seem to know that the Regional Rail Link project existed with Commonwealth funding, at the time he ruled out funding public transport by the Commonwealth Government, it sits well with that philosophy, but it doesn't sit well with the need for integrated transport and infrastructure solutions. The Greens political party don't like roads. Tony Abbott doesn't like rail. Where Labor sits is that we support infrastructure development that's appropriate, whether rail or road, and that you need to acknowledge that you need that integrated transport and infrastructure network. Infrastructure Australia must be able to have proper cost-benefit analysis, and in the Infrastructure Coordinator's submission to this inquiry reported today, it points out, one, that Infrastructure Australia wasn't even consulted on the more than 20 drafts of this legislation. The Infrastructure Australia senior, whether it be the executive staff of Infrastructure Australia, including the coordinator, or the chair of Infrastructure Australia, Sir Rod Eddington, people were not consulted about the very legislation, and they will not be able to have proper cost-benefit analysis unless the minister tells them to. And why is that the case? We see from some of the Infrastructure Coordinator's other comments, where he points out that the East-West link here in Melbourne and the West Connects project in Sydney have not been subject to proper cost-benefit analysis. Now, we have said there needs to be that cost-benefit analysis, it needs to be transparent, and people need to be able to see what the outcomes are. At the same time, they're promising to rip out the billions of dollars of funds that have already been allocated to important projects like the Melbourne Metro project and Cross River Rail that have had proper cost-benefit analysis done on them and have received the approval of Infrastructure Australia. So what these comments show is at heart in this legislation is the very existence of an independent Infrastructure Australia. It's a return to the days whereby political decisions will be made rather than decisions being made on the basis of productivity and economic benefit, and the days in which public transport didn't get dealt with, thereby consigning families to spend more time in their cars than they'll spend at home with their kids. So this is a critical issue. We'd call upon Tony Abbott to reconsider this legislation, withdraw it, go back to the drawing board and consult with Infrastructure Australia about what it should look like in the future. When we came into government, Australia was 20th out of 25 OECD countries for infrastructure investment as a proportion of the national economy. When we left office, the new government has inherited a situation whereby Australia is first in the OECD in both 2011 and 2012, investing more in infrastructure, public and private investment, than any advanced economy in the world. And that's the sort of record that Tony Abbott tried to criticise in his comments in Europe overnight.
Thanks. Thanks, Anthony. Are there any questions?
You say that Labor would be bound, should be bound by Infrastructure Australia's list. You might need to go from it?
Well, what we've done, we don't have to talk about these things in theory. Infrastructure Australia has put 15 projects on its priority list. All 15 of them were funded by the former federal Labor government. 15 out of 15.
Do you believe Infrastructure Australia is being punished for its public support of urban public transport?
Well, Infrastructure Australia understands that there's a relationship between rail and road. There's a relationship in terms of ports. There's a relationship in terms of urban development. One of the reasons why this project worked in terms of cost-benefit analysis was the uplift factor of economic growth and activity in places like Sunshine. I was talking to Tim yesterday about how this community is being transformed by the nature of this infrastructure investment. That adds value. In terms of Geelong, Bendigo and Ballarat, not just Melbourne, will all benefit from the uplift factor in terms of that growth corridor that's occurring. And we can see it from the places that I visited along the route of the regional rail link. Similar Melbourne Metro. The benefit of fixing up the inner circle, if you like, is that's a precondition for other economic activity in terms of new rail lines. But there's also benefit in terms of the road network. Benefit directly in terms of the removal of level crossings here and at other places along the route, but benefits also because if you make public transport more accessible, then you're also taking cars off the road and improving times, travel times, for people who use the road network here in Melbourne.
Could the government argue, though, that we've got plenty of very highly qualified public servants experienced ministers who can make these cost-benefit analyses?
Well, the truth is it doesn't happen. When I became the minister in 2007, I asked my department how many planners were left after 12 years of the Howard government in the federal department of what was then Transport. The answer was none. The answer was none. Their sole performance indicator, KPI, was has the money gone out the door? Then there was no analysis going back and looking at what was the impact of the funding that had been granted. One of the things that Infrastructure Australia does is not just look at the future, but it also looks at the analysis so that it's got right in terms of what the economic benefit has been of investments that have been made in projects that are part of the Infrastructure Australia process. So this is very important. It's also a dynamic process whereby, for example, on Melbourne Metro, we put $40 million there for the planning, and there's a dialogue and an interaction, and the state government's planning processes being made better as well. Too often our cities have suffered from housing being built without looking at transport connections, without looking at jobs, without looking at economic opportunities, social infrastructure, health and education. What Infrastructure Australia does by having that coherent economic analysis at arm's length of government is make sure that projects are funded on that basis, and a project like the Majura Parkway would never have got funding in terms of it's in the north of the ACT, essentially just wouldn't have got funding if it were left up to politics. If it were left up to politics. Here in this area of western suburbs of Melbourne isn't a marginal seat. It's important that funding go to where the benefit is. That's exactly what Infrastructure Australia does. And the Infrastructure Coordinator's submission is extraordinarily strong. From a public servant to make such a strong submission says a lot about just how bad the job is that's being done to do over the independence of the Infrastructure Australia process.
Mr. Hart, the Victorian government's done a pretty in-depth cost-benefit analysis, even if they've only released a pamphlet summarising it.
Where is it?
The pamphlet's out.
The pamphlet?
But so you've got all the peak bodies lined up saying it's a good project, AWUs is a good project. So where is the harm in just going on?
I think people are entitled to. I'm not opposed to any infrastructure project per se. I want to see, though, the analysis that's there. It's as simple as that. And it is, if you look at the Brisbane Cross River Rail project, has 7,000 pages of analysis and detail about what will happen at the stations, what the economic impact will be for the Gold Coast, for the Sunshine Coast. Here in Melbourne, the Melbourne Metro planning has with it the details of what the uplift factor are beyond the specific benefits, but the uplift factor by changing and making other infrastructure investment possible. So we need to do that. If the analysis stacks up, and we know that in Sir Rod Eddington's study, it made specific recommendations and had concerns about a BCR that we know was published as part of that transport study. Why shouldn't it be made transparent? That's precisely, we're not calling for anything other than what Tony Abbott said he would do. He said...
And that was the opposition leader